Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody online tonight. I'm Jeremy Blackshaw, and with Ignacio Lima from Bruxelles, we are the co-chairs of the Mining, Energy and CleanTech Practice Group for World Law Group, and we're very pleased to welcome you here today for our panel discussion on two aspects of the move to renewables. We're going to talk tonight about energy transition and the transition out from carbon intensive fossil fuels, and also the second half of the discussion, Ignacio will lead with some questions for our panel on the lithium market in a variety of jurisdictions and other rare minerals which are relevant to the renewables market. We're very pleased to have with us an expert panel representing a number of different jurisdictions. I have Kate Lyons from Goodmans in Canada, Yan Gao from Zonglun in China, Sebastian Verdoya from Bruxelles in Argentina, and my partner Simon Scott from Intrellison here in Australia. And it's great to have you all on. It would be terrific to have an interactive session. We're planning to leave some time at the end, but if you have any burning questions on the way through, please do try and use the chat function or wave your hand, and I'll do my best to notice you while we're in the middle of it and take it forward. But as it's now 5 past the hour, I might kick off as we have a fairly busy agenda. So I might kick it off by looking at the energy transition question, and I might throw to each of our panel members just to address the question of whether or not companies in your jurisdiction are moving to exit carbon intensive fossil fuel extraction. I might start with you, Kate, if you wouldn't mind. What's happening in Canada?
Thanks, Jeremy. In the United States, I've heard the Tesla referred to as the car that runs on coal because so much electricity generation in the US comes from coal. In Canada, we're really reliant on natural gas and hydroelectric power generation because we have to remember that batteries, of course, need some power from somewhere. So for sure, we're retreating from intensive carbon fuels, but we have to have some kind of fuel to have this whole lithium battery system work. So we're seeing a retreat for sure.
Thanks, Kate. Jan, what's happening in China?
China, this year, I think we are actually experiencing a huge fundamental energy industry revolution because the central government announced a huge ambitious plan of carbon neutrality by 2060 and reaching the peak carbon emission target before 2030. So the whole industry is working, making their plans, huge plans to achieve the target. So all the energy company, traditional oil companies, or power generation companies, they are working very hard. They make big plans to transition from traditional powered energy to renewables. That's is quite amazing.
And Simon, for our audience, the Australian electricity market has been very focused on coal as the fuel source of choice. Would you like to tell our audience a little bit about what's happening down here?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly Australia's market is still heavily dependent upon, particularly on the East Coast, heavily dependent on coal for the energy supply, but that is rapidly changing, and certainly I don't think anyone sees coal-fired new coal-fired power stations now being a prospect at all, and it's all about those closing down and managing that closure, because more than 60% of our East Coast is based on coal still. And then more broadly across the industry, yes, there are still some parties, Glencore being one, who's still heavily investing and further investment in coal. But outside of that, all of the diversifieds, and apart from met coal, all are exiting, and the traditional oil and gas companies are also heavily investing in alternative business models. Shell's back into the electricity trading game and building renewable power options, at the same time as it's still trying to exit or work out how it's going to exit more broadly. So, across the market, exit, but some value for some private money still.
Thanks, Simon. And Sebastian, what's happening in Argentina?
So what's currently happening is that we're having some political struggling, economic struggling, and so the agenda is kind of dominated by these kind of things that push back all other important topics out of the main places in the agenda. In terms of energy transition, our country is dependent on fuel and gas powered generation of energy. We have some dams and some nuclear facilities, but mainly gas and fuel oil generated electricity. Last administration made an effort in getting closer to the commitments that Argentina took under the Paris Climate Agreement, foster investments in solar. Some of those projects started to run, but then with this administration and the problems we had with the pandemic and everything, some projects that were being pushed forward under that umbrella stopped and were never constructed or built. So at the end of the day, with a goal of getting to 20% in 2025 of conversion, we nowadays have a kind of 13%, which is not that bad, but we are still behind what we are supposed to be doing at this point in time. And cars are 99.9% gas powered. We have some rules promoting the purchase of electric vehicles, like you don't pay for some kind of taxes, but we are far behind what we are supposed to be doing in terms of energy transition.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. So I might just turn then perhaps to what are the major drivers? Is it the reduction in carbon emissions that is driving the transition out in your jurisdictions? Why don't I start with you again, Kate? What's the fundamental driver? Is it public opinion? Is it meeting the Paris targets? What's behind it?
Well, I think that public opinion has driven the regulators, and the regulators have begun to institute. Am I getting an echo? Okay, have begun to institute tax regimes and so on, would put an additional tax burden on emissions. So in Canada, air emissions are regulated locally at this provincial or state level as well as federally. And a number of provinces rebelled against the federal carbon tax, and resulting in a court case in which the court upheld the federal government's ability to impose a carbon tax. So we have increasing carbon taxes, but with each election change, we have a different kind of regime. We used to have cap and trade, then we had that utterly abandoned and replaced by nothing. And then the federal government stepped in and said, if you don't put something in provinces, then you're going to have to comply with this, this federal program. But I noticed in terms of political pressure that an activist investor in the last month managed to rally shareholders of Exxon and get 2 board members on the board. So, and Harvard recently announced that it was getting out of any oil and gas investments in its endowment. So I think there's tremendous political pressure.
Okay. And Jan, what is the major driver in China for the transition out? It's the decisions of the government with the new targets. Are there any other factors?
Yeah, you're right. I think in China, the major driven or most of the things are driven by central government's policy or strategies. So the same as the current transition of the energy industry, because central government announced their carbon neutrality plan policy, and then early this year, the National Congress approved the recent 5-year plan with the target of to reaffirm the current policy direction with an added emphasis on climate changes that are both economic growth and a green commitment will be key considerations for the national plan. And after that, most of the provinces in China, that local governments have announced their own 5-year plan. And basically, they are trying to, to make cost-effective measures to prepare for the carbon peaking before 2030. Some inland regions are trying to increase more solar and wind generation capacities, while coastal provinces are focused on offshore wind and nuclear and LNG, natural gases. So basically, that's national policy-driven changes. Now we are talking about. I think the news is that the State Council has a working group leadership, and now they are making a overall and umbrella whole regime of a policy to promote, to encourage the energy transition, which including the control of decrease of using fossil oil energy, to promote the upgrade of manufacturing, to promote the energy saving buildings, to promote a green low carbon transportation system, and to develop green financing, including green bond, innovative financial products. And also, very importantly, they will complete the setup of the carbon market. But in July, in mid-July, we set up a nationwide carbon market in China and has had the first deal. I think that will be a very, very key step for the future development of green finance. In the future, I think that every company, energy company, will be included in the market, and they will have its own carbon pricing mechanism set up later on. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much what happens in China.
Okay. And in stark contrast, there's one thing you could say about the Australian market is it's not being driven by our central government. Simon, do you want to touch on what's driving the transition here?
I was about to say the stark contrast. Oh my! After several Commonwealth sort of national governments lost their seats, in Australia, it's very much being driven at the state level and by private. The federal government did initially, many years ago now, impose a number of carbon schemes, but when concepts of carbon taxes and other drivers and cap and trade and all the things that Catherine, you were mentioning were implemented. We lost several parliaments, went down, we went through 5 prime ministers in the space of, I can't remember, Jeremy, it was only a couple of years or whatever it was. And so it has very much been, there's a dearth of policy at the federal level. We might see some move in that in the coming months, but so it's been led by states and private, and more being led by private, even over and above the states. And that's partly public opinion, but I think it is also being led by foreign influence in a sense of things such as the talk of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. For example, the European discussion of that. We'll see our exporters start to realise they need to do something, and the federal government will finally realise if they don't collect the tax, it's going to be collected offshore. So I think that the driver is very much public opinion and state government, who are more influenced potentially by the public opinion issue than the federal government.
Yeah, and there's certainly public opinions had an influence on our financiers. So the big 4 banks have all variously said they're not going to support new coal projects. And I guess that drives me to the next question. For those companies which are exiting, are they selling their projects or are they shutting them down? Is there a market for assets that might be seen as stranded or at least not be able to be financed? What's happening in Canada, Kate?
Well, a couple of things. To sort of answer a completely different question than you asked, Jeremy, what we're hearing quite a bit about is repurposing the extraction infrastructure, because the way in which we mine lithium is not dissimilar to fracking. And so there is that sort of conversation and financing going on. We don't have a lot of coal generation in our country, and the controversy has been largely over pipelines. And my view of a pipeline is it's a corridor that carries things. So I think they'll be repurposed. But we had 2 major pipeline projects. Basically, one was just canceled, and the other one, the owner just put it up for sale and the government bought it. So I think in terms of retirement, there's a bit of disarray. And the most conversation that I'm hearing about is this notion of repurposing the extraction infrastructure. And I also think I mentioned when we were chatting about this in advance that we have a client that's a major steel company, and they are, because of carbon tax and environmental awareness and other things, they're actually converting from the coking process, which is has very high greenhouse gas emissions, to electric arc furnace. So that requires a major retooling of the plant. And they're out in the loan market right now, and there's considerable interest. So it's a different kind of repurposing from a manufacturing rather than extraction and transportation point of view.
Really interesting. Thanks, Kate. And what's happening down here, Simon? Is there a market for assets? Are they converting them into and repurposing, or it's shut down and abandoned, try to rehabilitate?
Look, presently, the only ones being shut down are the coal-fired power stations that are reaching end of life or are close to end of life, and they're just unsustainable economically to keep them open. And so certainly there's that. But it is the other carbon, both coal and gas, oil and gas, that are still, there is still a ready market. The structure of the deals are changing. Obviously, they're not being debt funded by any of the central banks or the big banks. They're more in deferred vendor financed arrangements. But I think one of the really interesting things is that everyone is recognising that there is a limited life to these assets. And so even while they're changing hands, they are looking at the sort of dividend return over a short period of time with no residual value, is one thing. And the other one is the challenge that of the ESG view that the majors should, with the big balance sheets, should be holding on to these assets and seeing them through to the end of their lives and shutting them down, and rather than offloading them. So while we saw a lot of pressure around the big international houses like BHP and Rio and Anglo American have all been offloading their thermal coal. The question is coming as to whether they should have kept hold of them and then shut them down appropriately. And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge for a couple of those ones who are still holding some assets at the moment, that they really should be shutting them down. Of course, they're making a hell of a lot of money today, tomorrow, and the next day, enough to actually fund it. The danger is it goes to private hands who that money comes out of the market and those assets are left to be remediated and dealt with by the community. So I think that will be the real pressure area.
Yeah, and that's been a feature, I think, of the Australian market, a lot of tension about the cost of rehabilitation and whether or not proponents actually have enough money to be able to do it. Jan, I'm interested in the situation in China, and then perhaps I might ask you, Sebastian, for a view, whether it's a fossil fuel mine or some other or some other project. Are rehabilitation costs and responsibilities generally increasing in your markets, or has the situation stayed the same?
I was listening to our colleagues all around the world and what's happening there. And it's interesting to compare that with what's happening here. The executive is about to send to the Congress a bill promoting oil and gas development of all kinds, and also investment in oil and gas infrastructure, with, of course, some tax benefits and foreign exchange benefits in terms of, keeping money abroad, to be able to pay for foreign financing, to pay for dividends, aiming to solve the problem, the macroeconomic problems we kind of, the short-term problems we are having, or mid-term problems we're having, and with a chapter aimed to developing regional or local communities and economy. So you can see that currently Argentina is focused on totally different things, focusing on trying to get dollars from wherever they can, no matter the footprint of carbon, or reduce the agenda of reducing emissions. This is not a priority right now for the political agenda.
So taking a shorter term view, perhaps.
We are going just the other way now these days. Yeah.
And Jan, just before I hand to Ignacio to talk about the other half of our topic this evening, what is the rehabilitation environment like in China? Are the requirements becoming more significant when a project comes to the end of its life, or has it stayed the same?
Well, I think in terms of oil and gas projects, Chinese government do set forth liabilities, on the operators, on all the partners of PSC, for example, for the abandonment, and they have to set up certain. It is required that they have set up funds, for the abandonment, and for coal mine or other mining. I'm not aware of any recent development, but overall the environmental, because now the compliance, environmental compliance issues has become very, very important. So I think in general, all the asset owners of fossil oil, fossil fuel assets, they have more liability, responsibility in terms of to take care of things after the project's done, or after the termination of the contract. That's my view.
Thank you very much. So some areas of commonality and some of difference. I'll now hand to Ignacio to handle the second part of our discussion, which is a focus on investment and projects in lithium and other critical minerals for the replacement technology that's coming in for the fossil fuels. Over to you, Ignacio.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning and good evening to everyone. As Jeremy said, we're going to go now for the second part of this webinar, and we're going to address one of the critical minerals for the development of renewable technology, and that's lithium. And I mean, with the global push for sustainability and low carbon footprint, lithium is now like the vedette here. So I'm going to start with one question for Sebastian and Simon on the general outlook of lithium investments in your region.
Okay, so thanks, Ignacio. What's happening in the neighborhood here is that, as you probably know, we have this lithium triangle, as it's called, which is a region in north of Argentina, south of Bolivia, north of Chile. This lithium triangle is shared by these three countries, where about 60% of the resources of the world in lithium is located, according to what I read. And the interesting thing is that this triangle is kind of a laboratory of experiments of different legal frameworks or solutions about what's supposed to be done with the resource. I say laboratory because each country has a different kind of a legal framework or solution for dealing with lithium. Just making it very, very brief, and this is kind of expected. Bolivia is a state-owned, state-controlled, state-managed development of lithium with a very, very small possibility for private companies to participate in part of the downstream or upstream industry. Germans have been trying to make efforts to make some kind of joint venture with the Bolivian government to push forward that kind of scheme, but so far they succeeding in completing something big. So in Chile, what has been happening is that since the 70s, lithium was declared as a strategic mineral because of nuclear use. At that point in time, lithium was a component for nuclear, kind of nuclear bombs, I would say. But then the lithium, even though no one, South Korea, developed nuclear bombs, lithium was kept by Chilean government and Chilean laws as a strategic mineral, and not subject to be granted in concession to privates. So it's kept state-owned, but they, through Porfo and other governmental vehicles, they entered into agreements with Albemarle and SQM to develop some of their resources, and that went kind of well. They have some, fights. You only fight with the government at some point in time, and that evolved into the current scheme they had, whereby this part of the lithium they produce, because of course they export the lithium they have, because Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, they practically don't have any downstream activity for lithium. So because that is located everywhere else, especially in Asia and the United States. But they're making some efforts to build up some facilities in the country, and under the agreements they have with SQL and Albemarle, 25% of the lithium they produce should be sold, if needed, to promotional prices to local companies interested in buying and processing lithium. So that's what happened in Chile. In Argentina, lithium has been treated, and it's being treated as all other minerals like gold, silver, copper. They are subject to the same regime, a regime that was designed in the 90s. It's a liberal design regime. Lithium at the federal level is not strategic mineral compared to Bolivia and Chile. Argentina is a federal country, and the resources, the minerals belong to the provinces. So the provinces are those that decide based on their own agenda and strategic goals, decide whereby they approve or not the projects, and they make the environmental evaluation and everything. So lithium is subject to general rules all across the country, with the exception of Jujuy province, which they are kind of more advanced, perhaps kind of following the model of Chile. They state-owned company. Its goal is to participate with a minority shareholding in these projects and securing first option to purchase up to 5% of lithium at market price, not at discounted price, but market price, and to be able to have lithium to supply local entrepreneurs willing to develop downstream business. So that's the picture. Having said all that, the problem that we have again are of macroeconomic and political nature. There is no financing for projects in general, for lithium in particular. So we are problems to push these projects forward.
Thank you, Sebastian. Simon, would you like to?
Yeah. Look, in Australia, our lithium resource is generally in Western Australia, and it is hard rock, and it is booming. There's just no other phrase for it. We have a large number of ASX listed companies who are developing resources. We've got all of the international players, from American, South American, and Chinese in the market. We have our first 2 lithium hydroxide plants being constructed by Tianqi and Albemarle, which are just in the process of being commissioned. And so we're moving from not just having an export of spodumene, but we'll have lithium hydroxide being produced here in Australia in some significant quantities given the market. So lithium is the game. I think the top 5 Australian listed companies have increased their market valuation 5-fold over the period of the last 5 years. And there was a sale of some off-specification spodumene earlier this week, a small volume, less than 10,000 tonnes, but still a reasonable size volume at $2,500 a tonne equivalent, which is a sort of 9-fold increase or 8-fold increase in a very short period of time. And so dramatic changes, and obviously the market will fluctuate in and out of balance in the near term, but it's all heading strongly up.
Thank you, Simon. We now go to the following questions, and I'm going to start with Kate. What would you say are the main challenges for lithium mining in your jurisdiction?
Thanks, Ignacio. Many people consider Canada an oil and gas and mining, a resource economy, and a lot of focus has been on pipelines down to the US, which was canceled by the president, to our coasts. So everybody's focusing on pipelines, and I think a lot of people believe that batteries are the sort of answer to the climate crisis. So there's just loads of excitement about it, and it's seen as a great opportunity. I think that the public perception, which will affect the regulatory framework, will eventually catch up to the fact that mining lithium has its own environmental footprint. I think that mining in Canada is considered, it's a very stable, safe economy in which to mine. There's not a lot there. It's fairly heavily regulated, but there's not a lot of political uncertainty around mining. And so what I foresee is people are going to realize that lithium mining is got its own environmental footprint and begin to raise concerns about that. As a general comment, mining in Canada, I would say one of the biggest issues that we really need to do better here is Indigenous engagement, which is a requirement of mining permits and mining infrastructure permits and so on. And we have a system where consultation with the impacted communities is required. And the consultation is sort of a spectrum. How big is the impact? How strong is the right or claim of the Indigenous group? And because it's a spectrum, there's no template for how you can properly engage and mitigate, if necessary, impacts. And so we're learning more and more about that as time goes on. We have a series of treaties we have with First Nations, but we also have a whole host of First Nations communities that have decided that treaties are not the way to go and that they get a fairer, better result in litigation. Every year we have substantial cases coming out of our Supreme Court that help us better understand the consultation obligation. But I think that understandably injects some uncertainty into the permitting timeline. So I would call that a challenge to mining in general, but to lithium.
Okay, Simon, what's the situation in terms of challenges in Australia?
Look, there is no doubt the challenge of any mining project. Being a hard rock resource in Australia, in terms of lithium in particular, it does not have the shall we say, the water table and more other difficulties that some of the brine resources have. We have similar challenges with engagement with our Aboriginal people in regard of the Indigenous, and there has been, and no doubt people are aware of, the Juukan Gorge experience that Rio had, and a number of the mines, the lithium mines in Australia, have similar Indigenous engagement challenges, shall we say, because a number of them are repurposed older mines that were originally tungsten or tantalum or tin or even iron ore mines that have become repurposed to lithium. And so they have some of the older challenges of older agreements that are no longer, quite frankly, acceptable in the current environment and having to be revisited. But generally, lithium mining at the moment, when you compare it to an iron ore mine that is stripping a much larger area of the environment, is not, from a public perception, as damaging, I suppose, as some of the other excavation activities, shall we say, are being undertaken. So generally has pretty good support from the market. And from a battery mineral perspective, yes, lithium in the west, but in Australia, on the east coast, where there are no lithium resources, we have vanadium, and the first of the large vanadium mines have just been approved only this week in Queensland. And so we're going to see other battery minerals sort of take off in other states. So everyone has their own critical mineral. The east coast has vanadium, the west has lithium. So yeah, and I think we'll see that around the world, that people will choose and chase the mineral that they have in the battery supply chain.
Simon, we now move from Australia to the other side of the world, to Argentina. Sebastian, what are the challenges there?
Okay, so since we are focused on brine, then we probably have the opposite picture that you just heard about Australia. In general terms, lithium projects are hit by macroeconomic and political issues as all other industries. Just probably the most important issue preventing some of these lithium projects to happen. Same thing is happening with other minerals. We have big silver, gold, copper projects on hold because of a lack of certainty in terms of economic rules and political rules. The promotional regimes have not been respected by the government. So currently there's no chance to to access the foreign exchange market to send dividends abroad. There is restrictions to repay for loans. So in this context, it's very difficult that anyone will invest. We've seen some Chinese companies and some Asian companies from other countries looking around, are interested in lithium projects, but the traditional investment flow has been coming from Canada, from the United States, from Europe in some cases. It's kind of stalling. So focusing more closely on mining, lithium is also impacted by the indigenous communities issues, although we don't have traditional issues of this kind. This indigenous communities issue became part of the agenda in the last few years. I would say that the situation is different than in Canada or the United States in terms of real existing of organized indigenous communities traditionally over the years. I would say that this community, generally speaking, these communities started to appear when mining development started to happen. And they are, generally speaking, because you have exceptions, but they are, generally speaking, they are being organized and pushed forward by people with political interest or with economic interest. So although they are raising flags that had to do with a fair indigenous communities claims and rights, the communication with them and the possibility of reaching agreements with them is kind of have distortions because of the goals that they are trying to achieve are not necessarily related to the rights they have at indigenous communities. So that's a work in progress. And the focusing more closely to the lithium activity, lithium mining activity, and to the opposite with our colleague in Australia was saying, here the lithium projects are focused on brine, and it's being developed on salars, which are wetlands. There's a very strong movement, NGOs, scientific community to put in place a wetlands federal law, setting up minimum protection principles and probably restrictions to the use of wetlands. Salars are wetlands, so it is to be seen to what extent this federal law, if finally passed, will affect lithium projects. Of course, this wetlands law is being resisted not only by mining or lithium mining, but also by a lot of other industries, because the way the problem we have is that these kind of laws are being designed by politicians and scientists without intervention of businessmen or the industries. So at the end of the day, you have probably a very protective law or efficient from the scientific standpoint, but seriously affects the possibility of a development of regions where the only thing you have is mineral resources to develop and to help the community to have a better life. So it is to be seen what happens with wetlands, but I would say that this is a key issue moving forward with lithium development in Argentina.
Thanks, Sebastian. We now move to the final questions, and some of you mentioned the need of financing. So I'm going to go with Jan and ask you what type of financing these lithium projects need in order to be developed, and which is the role of long-term supply agreements in this type of projects.
Okay, well, I'm not very familiar with lithium, but in terms of general mining financing, I think there are several ways in China which are quite probably overall applicable. One is if for a listing company, then of course they can capital raising money from the capital markets, and for the coal development. And second is or holding assets, they can borrow loan from the bank. That's quite traditional. Or certainly if they got private equity investment or other kind of investment institution, they could get financing from those type of institutions. So I think that's probably the most popular ways of raising financing for developing lithium reserves. And the long-term supply agreement, I think that's I think that's typical for all sectors. So this apply to lithium reserves as well. But the trend is I think other colleagues has talked about the increasing price. So lithium reserve has becoming very, very expensive in China recently year, because the development cars and the pricing has been so high. It's been several times, I think. Then everyone the lithium mine. Yeah, that's probably it.
Thanks, Jan. I will invite Simon, Keith, and Sebastian to comment on this as well. And Jan mentioned capital markets, private equity. I don't know which is the role of project finance in this project. So please go ahead.
After you, Simon. Australia seems to be rip-roaring.
Look, the challenge for project finance has been the lack of transparency in the pricing in the market and the ability to secure longer-term offtake. Certainly, what a number of the first movers have done is to partner with some of the major players. So a company, Mineral Resources, partnered with Albemarle, who has a long-standing position in the market in industrial metals. You've got a number of the juniors partnering with Chinese players who've got a demand in China for processing in order to address the issue. So they got equity investment effectively in return for partnering at offtake. Because of the issue with transparency of the pricing. And this is an issue we're seeing more broadly than just lithium with all these minerals, is how do you secure project finance in circumstances where there's a lack of transparency in the offtake, both duration and pricing. But lithium is developing pretty quickly, and I think we'll see that become more available. There has been debt financing, there has been some quasi-project financing. So all of those things. I think just one other challenge with it is also it's a new market, and with new markets you get some unusual things that people haven't thought about. One that Western Australia experienced was that we have the state owns the minerals, the miner pays a royalty to the state for the extraction of the mineral. But when we got vertically integrated companies that were mining the raw ore, then beneficiation to a spodumene product, which is a 6% lithium, and then some are then developing it on into lithium hydroxide, the royalty rate was the same for all of those products. And it meant a 5 and 20 time impost if you were processing it further into a higher level, or to a higher grade material. So the system was not keeping up. The regulatory system was not keeping up with the development. So these are new minerals. People just had lithium as the royalty reference point, and it was out of sync. It went from 5% to 20%, to I think it was 5 to 7 to 20 times the royalty impost. And so that developing, as you develop, you would call Western Australia a very developed minerals economy, but it hadn't adjusted its regime to cope with what was a fast developing industry. So that's pretty all I'd comment.
Simon, Kate, Sebastian, anything to add? Otherwise, we'll.
Yeah, of course, because of the same reasons I've been mentioning, project finance and almost every kind of finance here is very difficult. There's no local financing for this kind of projects because of the amounts involved. There's no market here for that. Lithium projects moving forward in our exploration construction stage have been mainly financed by equity, by intercompany financing, joint ventures. We have a project, for instance, with Toyota as part of the picture, and this Jujuy state-owned company that I mentioned. You have Phoenix project with Livent, but and some projects started to sell minority share parts of their projects to local players to get more money, and trying to put their projects in a size and shape capable of looking for bigger players to joint venture with. But it's very, very difficult for local companies, lithium and others, to get financing they need to develop the projects nowadays.
Sebastian, Kate, any final remarks that you would like to make on this?
Just that I agree with Simon. It's a very quickly emerging market, which creates some volatility, and it's obviously the prices have been going up and up, which creates this interest. I'm not sure the regulatory or pricing mechanisms have completely caught up. And then when you layer the pandemic on top of that, I'd be very, I'm going to just keep my money in my mattress, I think, for a while.
That's a good one.
Now,
Okay.
when I discuss with the banks, because the banks calls you because they want to do business, but they don't know what kind of business they want to make. But they know you have big clients, so they kind of explore. So when we talk about lithium, they say, no, we cannot finance that because volatility of the prices. We don't know what will happen beyond 7 years from now with prices, so we cannot build up a model of repayment of loans. So it seems that volatility of the prices is a very big issue for banks to finance this industry. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. This, ends up with the questions, and I don't know, Jeremy, Hannah, if we have some time for comments or questions from the floor. Saying that it's like 2 minutes to 10, but
we have 2 minutes. If there's anything pressing from anyone, please let us know. Seems not, or not that I can see. So as we're getting close, I will wind things up. But first of all, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panel members this evening for a very interesting discussion on the end of one industry, perhaps, or at least the wind down of one industry and its replacement with another. So if you could all join me with thanking Kate and Jan and Sebastian and Simon for a very interesting discussion tonight. Two very minor housekeeping matters. Hannah, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Hannah has been recording the session, so if you had any colleagues who were keen to make the presentation tonight but weren't able to do so, you'll be able to access it on the website. And secondly, Ignacio and I would welcome any suggestions or comments on further topics that you'd like to have discussed at our practice group meetings. Please feel free to call Ignacio or call me or drop us an email. We'd love to hear from you and put together another presentation or a discussion on topics that anyone would find of interest. It's fabulous from my perspective that we've got such a wide range of interested partners and World Law Group members around the world. There's so many similarities between the markets, but also some interesting differences, and I'm sure we can all learn something from each other. But thank you all again for attending tonight, and thanks again to our panel members for a fantastic discussion. I look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.